In this lecture, we're going to take a look at the nature and characteristics of discrimination under apartheid. So we'll kind of walk through the major laws that set up the apartheid system from 48 to 64. And a little intro. So we've already covered the rise of the National Party and D.F. Malan, wins the election of 48, and proceeds to create a series of laws to set up apartheid or apartness. He does it very quickly, faster than any other group. That's what's kind of shocking as far as how extreme the laws are and how fast they do it. So most of their laws are set up between 1948 and 1954. There are laws after that, but a vast amount of laws are passed in the early 50s. Historians tend to split apartheid into two types and two stages. First is petty apartheid, and it's just it's petty in all the ways that you're thinking of. And it's also known as boss cop or boss rule. This is developed in the early years under Malan, right here, and under Strijdom, right here, and very pleasant looking guys there. The goal here is complete domination of white over black, so they are being as petty as possible, and often brutal and overreaching regulation to control everyday life for black citizens. Grand apartheid is kind of the next stage, developed in the late 50s by H.F. Verwoerd, in 58 to 66 until he's assassinated. And this goal is largely about segregation. So first it was about control, and now it's about let's completely separate them away, hoping to give them independence and reduce world criticism of apartheid. And so let's break down some of these different laws, starting with the Population Registration Act of 1950. Now, to get apartheid going, you need to figure out, well, who's who is in what race. And so it was necessary to classify all people into races to enforce all of the laws. Before this, there was a lot of fluidity. People could pass for a different race than their biological race. And so if somebody looked white, was raised in a kind of white culture, they could be considered white. It wasn't a straightforward thing. For example, we've got this family where it's not straightforward. Are they black? Are they white? They're both. So this law creates a national population register with three races: white, colored, and Bantu. Later on, Asians are added into the colored category. They set up a government board, the Race Classification Board, created to enforce, create further subdivisions within races, but also to judge cases where they're not sure, where a person's race is disputed. How do you determine race? Again, another tricky thing, and they're going to use horrible tests to do it. A lot of colored people would attempt to be classified as white to avoid discrimination. They're going to try to work their way into the system to be classified as white. However, neighbors could report on neighbors. Anybody that they thought were classified in the wrong race, they could call the cops, call the police, and see if they could change somebody's status. If they had to go before the board, there would be humiliating tests to determine what race they were. This could include language tests, which could be difficult, and there's so many languages in South Africa. But they'd also use things like skull measurements, using race biology, which just has no basis in science. And there's also the pencil in the hair test. And they just stick a pencil in the hair. If your hair was curly or frizzy at all, and it didn't fall out, you would not be considered white. Again, there are many flaws in these tests. They're not perfect at all. White people could also be classified as color under some circumstances, in that if they had darker skin, or if they didn't pass these tests, they could be moved into the colored category. And there were tragic consequences, for example, in that genetic traits that skipped a generation could reappear. A child of white parents with darker skin or frizzy hair could be classified as colored, according to these tests. Prohibition of Mixed Marriage Act. There's an adorable Trevor Noah with his parents, who violated these laws, well, in their own ways. Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act, 1949. This was the first law passed by the apartheid government, so it shows that this is kind of a key feature here. And it made it illegal for white South Africans to marry people of other races. Then it wasn't a problem to begin with. Mixed marriages were not that common before this act. And then Trevor Noah's parents never actually got married. They, however, did violate the Immorality Act, which banned all sex between whites and non-whites. This doesn't apply to sex between non-white groups, so they didn't care if it was black and colored. It's specifically about the purity of the white race in this case. And so this was enforced by police raids, hoping to catch a couple in bed together at home. So they would just knock down the door in the middle of the night, hoping to find an interracial couple. If a guilty couple, they would face heavy fines and prison terms, and with often the Black Party would receive harsher punishment. And so there's his parents, and his book was called Born a Crime, kind of talking about this crime in particular. Reservation of Separate Amenities Act. Okay, so similar to America, we're going to segregate just about everything. So all public services, anything in the public space will become segregated. And in many areas that was already that way, they just expand the system even further. So buses, trains, toilets, and hospitals already started to be segregated. We're going to expand it in this case. So they'll create separate entrances that will be added to shops, post offices, and train station waiting rooms will be separate. Parks, pools, beaches would be designated for only a single race, no mixing. Hotels and restaurants in white areas were instructed to only allow white people into those areas. And if anybody tried to break these rules, non-whites risked arrest and prison sentences for entering whites-only facilities. If a white person entered a black-only area, there really was no enforcement. It was just more of a cultural norm where they didn't really fit in, but it was more about black people in white areas. Then the police start to crack down. So here are a couple examples of a train station and a beach being split according to race. Group Areas Act is kind of an expansion on this, 1950, where they're going to look at the cities. City centers, the goal was to create them for white residents only, so non-white amenities were not included there. As the cities were meant to be built for whites, they didn't include anything for black people, which is going to make it very difficult. Few amenities were built in these areas. So few amenities like parks and nicer areas would be built in the black townships, or they were of subpoor quality. Nobody's going to really want to go there anyways. Access to a lot of the great public spaces for culture, like libraries, theaters, and concert halls, they're limited. Black people would not have access to things like libraries or going to the theater. Thus, it really limits the educational and cultural opportunities of Africans, in that they can't go to the library, they can't go see a play. Very demeaning for Africans, having this limited access, not being allowed to enjoy the culture of the world. But it also made it very difficult for whites and non-whites to maintain or start friendships, in that they were not allowed to be in the same space. Now, that doesn't say that black people were not allowed in the cities. They were allowed in the cities as long as they were working. So there was certainly, in this cartoon, kind of showing that, where there would be black nannies with white children. And so it's a complex system here. Pass Laws Act, aka the very long, the Natives Abolition of Passes and Coordination of Documents Act of 1952. So they get rid of the old passes and come up with a way more complex system of passes. So instead of just a couple papers, now it's a 96-page book you have to carry around. This got rid of the old ones, now you have to the big one. These are known as reference books, and this includes your entire record. Employment records, tax payments. Anytime you've made contact with the police, it's all in that book. Your entire life is all recorded in that book. Under this law, it made it a criminal act for black people if they did not present their passbook when asked. So any white person, even a child, could ask any black person to see it, and if the black person denied, they could be arrested. Police often would use this as an intimidation tactic, and this would just be an excuse to stop anybody at any time if they wanted to mess with them. Within the system, there's a system of travel permits to be stamped into the books. So this is used as a way to keep Africans in certain areas, especially if they want to, if the white population wanted to keep them on the mines or in certain jobs. And so if they wanted to travel to certain areas, they had to get permission from the local authorities. Especially if they wanted to go from a rural to whatever area, if they wanted to go to the city. Once in the city, they can get permission from the police for a 72-hour permit to look for a job. If they don't find a job, they have to go back home. But in most cases, if you're going all the way to the city to find a job, you're desperate. And so most would take the risk, continue past the 72 hours to continue looking for work, but they'd be arrested because those passbooks are constantly checked. Unable to pay the fines once they're the court fees, they would be thrown in jail, and then once they're out of jail, they get shipped back to the village, and they're going to do it all over again. So it's very much a hassle. They would also use this as an excuse to raid ANC politicians' homes in the hope of finding someone who didn't have their papers or someone that didn't have the proper permits. ANC activists would use the passbooks as a symbol of apartheid. Here's Mandela about to burn his passbook, and some women protesting their passbooks as well. And we'll talk about this next week with the Defiance Campaign of '52, where protesters presented themselves by the hundreds at police stations, saying arrest me. So a huge act of civil disobedience with the passbooks. Group Areas Act. This is designed to segregate urban areas into whites-only residential zones. So pretty much they make big cities like Johannesburg here a white-only zone. This is based on the earlier Soye Report of 1947 as a result of World War II, with the assumption that blacks were, more racism here, blacks were a naturally rural people, that they belonged just biologically off in the villages and not in the big cities. The big city would corrupt them. So they'd be allowed in the cities as long as they had a job, if they were economically useful. But they had to, and so they could work in the cities, but when the sun goes down, and these are sundown towns, they had to go back to the edges of the city, to their townships, black townships on the edges of these larger white cities. So they can come in to work in very low-level labor, but at the end of the day, they have to get out of the town. And if you didn't have a good job, they were forced to move not just beyond the edge of the city, but all the way to the native reserves. Before '55, mostly this was targeting Indian and colored businesses, owners in the cities, and that there was a little job competition. Whites wanted those spots, and wanted to get rid of that competition, so it was another excuse to kind of clear them out.